completely demystify exactly how India prices its fuel and how it handles massive global economic shocks. Have you ever wondered about the hidden gears turning behind the scenes every single time you pull up to a petrol pump? Well, in this explainer, we're going to map out the wild history and economics of fuel prices here in India. We're pulling back the curtain on a truly monumental financial maneuver known as the oil bonds. Okay, let's dive into this. Have you ever watched the news, seen that global crude oil prices just took a huge nosedive, and thought to yourself, awesome, filling up my tank is going to be so much cheaper tomorrow, only to find out that it absolutely isn't? It's a totally natural question, and it directly connects huge global macroeconomics to the literal taxes you pay right there at the pump. To figure out why this happens, we have to look back into the past and examine a massive financial debt that the country carried for nearly 2 decades. To make sense of the whole shebang, here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with the global oil crisis, move into the billion-dollar dilemma the government faced, look at the creation of the oil bonds, explore the path to deregulation, and finally look at exactly how this massive debt was paid off. Let's kick things off with part 1, the global oil crisis. To really get where this story starts, we have to set the scene back between the years 2004 and 2010. During this window, global crude oil prices were just skyrocketing. Because of intense geopolitical tensions and a massive surge in global demand, crude oil crossed a staggering $140 a barrel. So on one hand, you had these incredibly high market prices, but on the other hand, there were low government-mandated retail prices. Now, India is the world's third largest oil consumer. If the government had simply allowed those soaring global costs to hit citizens directly at the pump, it would have triggered hyperinflation, totally crippled the domestic economy, and honestly caused severe political backlash. So to shield everyone, the government stepped in and heavily regulated fuel prices to keep them artificially low. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the severe financial bleeding it highlights, a concept called under-recoveries. See, while the public was protected from that $140 a barrel shock, the math still had to add up somewhere, right? State-owned oil marketing companies, or OMCs, think IOCL, HPCL, and BPCL, were just hemorrhaging money. They were forced to buy crude oil on the international market at those sky-high rates, but the government mandated them to sell the refined fuel to the public at low, subsidized prices. The gap between their huge costs and their tiny revenue created massive, crushing financial losses, which economists call under-recoveries. Which brings us straight to part 2, the billion-dollar dilemma. Well, the government was technically supposed to compensate these oil marketing companies for their under-recoveries right out of the union budget, but they faced some seriously stark choices. Option A, pass the cost directly to consumers. But as we just discussed, that triggers hyperinflation and basically wrecks the economy. Then there's option B. The government pays direct cash subsidies to the oil companies to cover the difference. The huge problem with option B is that paying billions in direct cash would have caused the national fiscal deficit to just explode way past any acceptable targets, putting the country's broader financial stability at major risk. Neither crushing the everyday consumer nor blowing up the national balance sheet was an acceptable path forward. The government was truly stuck between a rock and a hard place. So how did they fix it? Let's move to part 3. Enter the oil bonds. Take a second and just absorb this number, 1.34 lakh crore rupees. It is an absolutely massive figure. Between 2005 and 2010, the UPA government came up with a clever, temporary financial mechanism to keep the oil companies afloat without having to spend immediate cash from the treasury. This massive number, that represents the total value of the oil bonds issued to the OMCs during that crisis period. But what exactly is an oil bond? Well, instead of handing the bleeding oil companies actual cash, the government gave them securities, or promissory notes. You can think of this as a massive national-level IOU. The government essentially told the oil companies, look, we can't pay you this cash today, but we promise to repay the principal amount 15 to 20 years down the line. And to make sure the OMCs could actually survive in the meantime, the government agreed to pay them annual interest on these bonds. It was basically a way to kick the massive financial can down the road while keeping the fuel flowing today. However, writing endless IOUs obviously couldn't go on forever. That leads us to part 4. The path to deregulation. Let's move to and see how this builds. You see, the practice of just issuing oil bonds was entirely unsustainable. Recognizing this, India began a long-term policy shift to dismantle that whole administrative pricing system we talked about earlier. After issuing 1.34 lakh crore rupees in bonds up to 2010, a major shift happened. In June 2010, petrol prices were completely deregulated, meaning they were linked directly to global market rates. Then, fast forward to October 2014, under the NDA government, diesel prices were also fully deregulated. The absolutely critical takeaway here is what deregulation actually achieved. By allowing retail prices to move with international crude fluctuations, the government permanently ended the era of generating new underrecoveries. The financial bleeding was officially stopped, and no new oil bonds had to be issued. But the story doesn't end there. While the bleeding stopped, that massive original debt, that 1.34 lakh crore rupee IOU, was still just sitting on the nation's balance sheet. It was ticking like a clock, just waiting for its 15 to 20-year maturity date. And eventually, that clock struck midnight, bringing us to our final section, paying off the debt. So the crucial point is that spanning from 2014 all the way to 2026, that heavy bill finally came due. For over a decade, successive union budgets had to set aside thousands of crores annually just to service the interest. Actually, get this. The accumulated interest alone exceeded 1 lakh crore rupees over 2 decades. And as the 15 to 20-year lifespans of the bonds expired, the principal repayments hit the government's balance sheet in heavy waves. The peak redemption window landed right between the 2021-2022 and 2025-26 fiscal years. So how on earth did the government find the cash to pay all this off? And this brilliantly illustrates the mechanics of the repayment strategy. Let's go right back to our very first question in this explainer. Why didn't fuel get cheaper when global prices dropped? Well, here's your answer. Step 1. When global crude prices plummeted during the mid-2010s and early 2020s, the central government saw a major opportunity. Step 2. Instead of passing the full benefit of that price drop onto the consumer by cutting retail prices, the government raised excise duties and central taxes on petroleum products. And Step 3. The massive chunk of revenue collected from these elevated fuel taxes was systematically channeled directly into paying off those maturing legacy bonds and that huge mountain of accumulated interest. By executing these scheduled massive cash payouts through successive union budgets, using those exact excise duties, India successfully cleared the final major tranches of these 15 to 20-year legacy oil bonds. It required strict financial discipline and leveraging taxation during times of low global prices, but it effectively closed out this specific historical oil debt chapter from the national balance sheet once and for all. Which leaves us with this final thought. The whole story of India's oil bonds is honestly a masterclass in macroeconomic trade-offs. The public was shielded from hyperinflation back in 2008, sure, but the cost was ultimately paid through elevated taxes at the pump over a decade later. It really forces us to ask a deeply important question about how nations manage crises. Is the short-term relief of subsidizing resources today worth the long-term tax burden of tomorrow? It's a fascinating question with absolutely no easy answers, but understanding this history gives us some incredible context the next time we look at the price of fuel. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep asking those great questions.